Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. The subject here is creating the wow value. I've said a few times that my intention with these videos is to try to lower the learning curve that we see with Photoshop, Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw. Now the way to do that is to lay out the videos in a logical learning order, and where possible try to focus on one tool or technique at a time. Now that's not always possible, of course, due to the nature of digital imaging, but we do our best. This ranking of videos from the easiest first, moving on to the more involved, also allows the viewer to be able to identify and dip into any video of their choice, or maybe even go back for a refresher. To this point I've recorded quite a number of videos on different techniques and tools, but there comes a time when we need to string all of those tools and techniques together into a full start to finish manipulation. Now I think we've probably reached that point about now, and what I'd like to do here is to take you through an entire workflow from start to finish using the tools we've already looked at and hopefully create some wow value. I'll also talk you through my reasons for the editing steps that I'm taking, and we'll bring the tools we need together in a real project. This is a dawn shot in the Blue Mountains in Sydney. The sun is coming up way to our left, and that's causing a few contrast issues. It's giving me nice warm tones and some atmosphere too. But the famous Three Sisters rock formation are in shadow, and the sky is quite brightly lit, so we have some work to do. If you look up at the top right of the screen just below the histogram, you'll see that I used an aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of a 15th of a second. Now the image was shot from a tripod, so we shouldn't have any issues with sharpness. So I'm going to start off with lens corrections. Remember, global changes first. So lens corrections, I'm going to go to my profile. Chromatic aberration I'm going to tick, and I'm going to enable the profile corrections. Now I've gained, I suppose, so much experience and confidence in the chromatic aberration that I very rarely do what I'm about to do now, and that is to enlarge the image quite a bit and really look to make sure that the chromatic aberration, if any, has gone. Now I can do that simply by unticking the box, and there we can see evidence that there was a little there, not too much, but that does seem to be getting rid of it completely. So I'll hit Control 0, a nice easy shortcut to fit the image back on screen. Now I think I've got pretty good composition in camera, but that would be my next stage. So I'm going to go up to the crop tool here, click, I've got the overlay turned on. I'm going to click and drag over the image, and as you can see the composition looks pretty good, but we do have, I suppose, quite a bit of darkness down the bottom here. Is that going to add to the picture, I wonder? And if we look at the rule of thirds top line, if we could raise that up a little bit so it was closer to this, because you can see as it dips down here it's in a strong position there. The Three Sisters are in a pretty strong position too. So maybe, and to give the image a little bit more of a panoramic look, maybe we could just bring the crop up. Don't want to come up too much, otherwise it just looks a little unbalanced. I think that's looking pretty good to me. So I'm going to commit that, but remember, we're working raw, nothing is really committed, but I'll touch the Enter key and then we can move on from here. What I'd like to do next is to go back to the tabs at the top right and select the basic tabs. Sometimes when we look at a picture like this we can see that we've got some darker tones in shadow down here and we've got some lighter tones up here. How do we know if the tones up here are going to be okay? Well, sometimes when I'm working through an image like this, to make sure, I'll just grab the exposure and just drag it down. If I can lose all of the white in an area of highlight, then I know the tone is there and I know I can do something about it. There are some images that if we get down this low with the exposure and we can still see white areas, well, they actually go a really muddy grey when we get this far. Then we know we've got some problems. Not only have we got some problems with the editing, the problems actually started with the exposure. So I'm going to double click my exposure and reset it so I know my sky is okay. I do have to fix a couple of dust spots, but maybe I'll wait until I've got a bit of tone in the sky and we'll have a look at those in a moment. So where do we start? Well, we start by looking at the histogram, and we can see a couple of peaks, one on the left, one on the right, but again there's no real straight edge on the right hand side, so this is telling me what I showed you a few moments ago. This is showing me that we've got quite a bit of shadow in the image, but it's not blocked up shadow, otherwise we'd have a straight line up here. So we've got an image we can work with. So let's start maybe by just improving the clarity, the mid-tone contrast. I'd like to look at pushing up the shadows too. I'll step that up halfway. That looks pretty good. I want a bit more vibrance in this, so let's bring that up too. And now I'm starting to get something that's looking a little bit more attractive. I'm also a little concerned about the colour balance here. The slider here is down in the cool area of the temperature. Now it's obvious if I move it to the right I'm going to warm everything up, but I seem to recall it was a little bit warmer than this at the time, so I'm going to do that. Just bring the glow of the sun as it starts to light those ridges in the background, and of course it warms up the tones here. We can't make the shadows too bright, they're just going to look unnatural. So far so good. I can see now that I've got a little bit of a problem with the highlights, but of course we're going to deal with those in a moment, and we'll probably use a graduated filter for that. Now it's a funny thing that when we start to manipulate images, the longer they're on screen, the easier it seems to be to see some of the problems that we create with our editing. And I think I've created a bit too much warmth here. I'm actually going to drop that back down a little bit just to take the edge off of that. I'm going to bring that a little bit away from the mauve as well, because I think we're beginning to lose that yellow. So I'm just tempering that just for a moment. Can always come back a little bit later. So what I'd like to do next then is to deal with the sky. I'm going to pick up my graduated filter. I'm going to hold the shift key and draw the filter down. Remember, we can always change where the filter starts and ends after we've applied any changes. Now we don't seem to have too much happening within the graduated filter, because if you look over on the right we've only got a couple of options moved here, and one of them is shadows, and that's not going to have much impact here. But I'll right click within this and reset it, and I'll touch the V key to lose my gradient overlay. Now I'm going to go up to the top of the screen and I'm going to drop down the exposure in the sky. Let's have a look at the highlights, and now we start to get a little bit of an imbalance here. We're getting too much colour up on the left hand side. Maybe I can just drop the saturation there to get it a little bit more natural. That's not looking too bad. Let's try a bit of clarity, a little bit of dehaze maybe, and that's looking better. Let me touch the V key. I want to bring that graduation down, but I don't want it to come too far down, because if it starts to darken these edges it doesn't look quite right to me. So the sky needs to be fairly delicate. I think I'm going to touch the V key once more. I'll just try a little bit more at the top. That's not looking too bad. I'm going to live with that for a little while. No, I'm not. The more I look at it, the more I think I still need to bring this up a little bit. To something like that, maybe. Have you noticed that if you were to type a complicated letter and you read the letter as soon as you've completed it, you read all over your spelling mistakes, your typos, and even completely missed words? Well, I find that sort of thing happens with our images. And what we do sometimes as we sit in front of our computer and work through an image like this, we do something on Tuesday evening, and on Monday morning when we open the image up, we think, what on earth possessed us to do that? The cause of this is that creative flow. Now that's good, of course, we want that, but sometimes it runs away with us. So there are times when it is a good idea, if you can and you have the patience, to click Done, which locks all those changes into that raw file, and I could walk away from my computer and maybe come back just a little later and have another look. If I'm still happy when I come back, then I'm going to suggest it's probably about right. But if when I come back and reopen the image, sometimes I find things I did previously I now want to tweak just a bit. Now when I open up my image again, I do think perhaps I've got just a little too much colour in the top of the screen. So I'm going to investigate making a slight change. Maybe I've got a little bit too much vibrance in here. I'll drop this back. What I'm doing here is quite natural. We move around, we increase the temperature, we come back to the vibrance, we change the density, which then has some impact on the colour. And I think that looks okay. I could go back to my graduated filter, click it to liven it up, and I could take a little more colour from that. But what I'd like to do next is perhaps deal with those spots in the sky. So to do that, I'm going to double click the zoom tool to get the image up to 100% or thereabouts. I'll select my spot removal tool and I'll tick the box to visualize the spots. There's one. You can see that Photoshop works by, I think the way Photoshop has helped speed up the way the software works is that when we're moving around, it temporarily blurs the picture and then sharpens it up as it comes to a stop. That looks pretty good to me. I will come down and just have a look along this area just to make sure nothing stands out. You see, I think there's a tiny one there maybe. And these are the little marks that we may miss. I think that's probably got most of them, but I will have another look a little later. I'm going to remove the visualize spots and hit Control 0, and I'll select my hand tool to get rid of those overlays. Now when we're looking at the picture, I've got a pretty good solid base to the picture, but the top still looks a little weak to me, just that top area. So what I may do is to investigate if I can actually put another graduated filter on there. Just one at the top, and I'll hold the shift key just to drag it down a little bit, something like that. Right click within it to reset it, and then I'm going to hit the V key because I only want a delicate change here. We can try the highlights and the exposure just to give a little more. And do you notice we've got a weakness in the corner here compared to the left corner? So I wonder if it's even worth considering another gradient. Now we're a little bit locked in up at the top right there, so I'm just going to hold my Control, Alt and Spacebar key. Sounds more complicated than it is. The zoom tool appears as a minus and I can click once and it just gives me a little space to work. I'll click the new graduated filter option here, which gets rid of those other two out of our eye line, and I'm just going to drag this one in just at an angle up there. Let's take this off and that off. I'll hide them once again, the overlays, just to bring that right hand side down a little bit, just so we've got a little more balance. I'm going to have a look at just bringing up a little bit of light in the foreground here on the shadow side of the Three Sisters. I'm going to do that using my adjustment brush, so I'm just going to click and drag to create the pin, right click the pin and reset anything that it may already have within it over on the right here, because I just want to increase the exposure a little bit here, maybe a little more of the shadows, but I don't want to do it too much. Now I think I'll zoom in a bit and bring my brush size down. I've got a 50% feather, I've got a flow of 2 down at the bottom right, so I think that's probably going to be okay, and I'm just going to lift the tones around here, and I may even add a little more colour in them, just bring out that warm tone a bit. And I'll make the brush a little bigger for the tree line here, just trying to take the worst of that darkness. I'll leave the bottom, I won't go too close to the bottom. Hold in the space bar, click and drag. We can make a little more of the rock formation there, throw a bit more light on that. Brush size down a little bit as we start to get near the edges, because we do not want to show the work we're doing. If I drift over the edge there, of course I will make a mistake, but of course we can erase from an adjustment brush, so all is not lost. But you can see we've got a bit more now coming through on the Three Sisters, which I think does improve things. A little bit light along that streak. Is there anything I can do with that? Well, let's try by maybe adding a new brush. I'll just brush along that area, and what we'll do here is reset those two and take the highlights down and the exposure down, and we'll just brush over this area, and I'm not too keen on the effect I'm getting there straight away. I'm putting back some of the problems that I was talking about earlier, so I'm going to get rid of that. Just remove the pin. I'm going to take that colour off because I think that was screwing it up, and I'm going to have another go, but I'll do it with the image a bit bigger. And I'm being a bit more delicate now. As you can see, I'm a sweep of my brush and then I'm stopping to have a look, a little bit on the edge there. Image editing is all about being delicate, of course. Very delicate in some instances. A little bit of weakness down that side, so maybe I could just sweep my brush in. I'd like to make the image a bit smaller. Let me drop it down now and just sweep in on that side. And there you can see what I was doing there. Control 0. I think I need another timeout. So let me hit the hand tool and we'll sit back and take a look at what we have. So with the spinning round of the screen, let's put the final touches to this. I'm going to put a radial filter around the outer edges. So I'm going to pick up the radial filter and just double click in the picture, and it'll be positioned around the edge. The feather is around about 53. I'm going to touch the V key to hide the overlay and drop down the exposure a little bit. I think something like that should just about do it. But just before I commit this, I'm going to drop the size of the image down just a little bit. I'm going to hit the V key to bring the shape back. I'm just going to drag it outside just a little bit, just so that I tease out the effect. In fact, if I hit Control 0 and we click the mask, we can see exactly what the mask is doing. So if we did want to drop the feather back a little bit, and you can see it pulls back from the center. There I'm going far too far. We can see the effect. Let's take a look at that without the mask, and we'll take a look at it without the overlay. I think I'm seeing a little bit more than I would like, so I'm going to increase that feather a little bit and maybe just drop that back a bit, and I'm really fine-tuning now. But of course there does come a point when we have to return to the basic tab and say, well, for the moment we're happy with the image, and we can open this up into Photoshop. Now there is another tool I'd like to deal with a little bit later on, and they're called Smart Objects. Now because I use them all the time, I've inadvertently left them turned on. So if you look down at the button at the bottom left, you can see mine says Open Object, whereas yours may say Open Image. So please ignore that we're opening an object here. We're just going to use this to open the image into Photoshop. So at this stage I've done the global editing, I've done the strategic editing, and once I get the image opened up into Photoshop, then I'll do any last minute things that I notice. I think looking at this over a few moments, a couple of things I would like to do. There's a couple of little well, they're not really highlights, but they're the sort of things I deal with. I'm going to pick up the spot healing brush, a little bit of light tone in the rock right on the edge. I just usually touch them in. Another one there if I can cover that up, and if it doesn't work I'll use the healing brush, and I'll take a clone source just from the side there, just to shut that off at the end, and maybe this one here. The other thing that is drawing my attention is maybe the tones are still a little weak along the top. So I'm going to pick up my burn tool from the toolbox in Photoshop, a nice big brush, even bigger than that. I'm going to affect the mid-tones. We've got three options we can affect: shadows, mid-tones or highlights. I'm going to drop that exposure down a lot less than that, 3 or 4%, 5 should be okay. I'm just going to brush in over that area. I'm just brushing and looking. See what I'm doing? Just looking, just bringing it down very, very gently. There's a tendency here to push these controls up, and then the problem is the brushes start to run away with us. Perhaps 5 is a bit on the low side. Perhaps I could get away with it a bit higher than that. Let's choose 8. But there you can see there's quite a change now. Maybe just a little bit extra on the right hand side, but I think there comes a time when we have to say we're happy with what we've done. I'd just like to introduce a suggestion at this point. We've got a landscape here, and we have cropped it so we've got a bit more of a panoramic shape. We're not working on the 3:2 aspect ratio that the digital SLR created, but sometimes I add a little bit more to that panoramic effect, and I do so by actually distorting the image. Not much. I'm going to go to my image menu and image size, and normally with the image size the width and the height are locked together in register, but we can click that chain link and separate them. What I'd like to do here is just add maybe 300 or 400 pixels onto the width. So I'm going to make this 6000 pixels, but what happens is we're adding pixels on the width but not on the height, and it just gives our picture just a little more of a panoramic look. Quite often I find that appeals to me. So now we get to the fun part where we can look at the image we've created. Now I'm going to save this image in a moment as a JPEG. I'd save it at a compression of level 12. That's going to give me this image that I can open up at any time into the future, but it also still leaves me with my raw file with all of the changes that we applied to this still set, so I could pick up from the raw file at any time in the future. But now let's look at the image we started with, the untouched image, and what we've done with a series of small steps. Quite a considerable change to the image. Photography is an art, and I've never seen it any different to that from the very first time I picked up a camera, and that's quite a number of years ago. But of course, when we work through a manipulation like this, there's going to be plenty of rights and wrongs, but there's also going to be a lot of personal preference.